According to Maimonides, the most famous Jewish rabbi of all time, the Jewish Messiah will successfully fight the battles of the Lord and gather the children of Israel back to the Holy Land and rebuild the Jewish temple on the spot where the Dome of the Rock is right now. And now, for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people have their own army, the IDF, that is successfully fighting battles in the name of the God of Israel. And Jewish people from all over the world have been gathered back into the Holy Land, and they've taken it over, and they're on the verge of sacrificing a 10th red heifer that everyone used to think is impossible to find, so that they can use its ashes to purify themselves and destroy the Dome of the Rock and build a Jewish temple in its place. To many religious Jews, it looks like Maimonides' predictions are coming true, and that the Jewish Messiah is about to appear. There's just one problem. The Messiah already came 2,000 years ago, just before the destruction of the Second Temple, but the rabbis rejected him. Let me explain. Religious Jews have been waiting and praying for the Messiah ever since the evil Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 585 BC defeated them and enslaved them and expelled them from Jerusalem and destroyed the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. I've told the story of the destruction of the two temples and how that shows that the Jewish people are not ethnically chosen people of God. Link in the description below. So since that time, the Jewish people have been waiting and praying for a Messiah who would come from the line of King David. King David is the greatest king of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, they believe he's a king, not a prophet. Muslims believe he was infallible. According to the Jewish people, he was a great king, he's revered. We're waiting for his dynasty to return. But according to the Jewish people, he committed murder, he committed adultery. And that's significant because if you believe that he can be a great Jewish hero while committing adultery and murder, then this can be used by corrupt religious authorities to justify their own corruption in the name of religion. So the Jewish belief is that the Jewish Messiah will be from the line of King David, and he will return the Jewish people to the Holy Land, and he'll rebuild the temple, and he'll be wealthy and powerful, and the Jewish people will be wealthy and powerful, and they'll be free from domination by foreign powers once again. 70 years after the destruction of the temple, God sent the children of Israel a Persian king whose name was Cyrus the Great. He defeated the Babylonians, and he returned the Jewish people back to Jerusalem, and he helped them rebuild the Jewish temple. But they remained under foreign domination. They were dominated by the Persians, then by the Greeks, then by the Romans, and so they were still waiting for a Messiah to free them from foreign domination and make them wealthy and powerful once again. God sent them a Messiah 2,000 years ago. It was Jesus, the Son of the Virgin Mary. Not the Son of God, the Son of the Holy Virgin Mary. But they rejected him. If they'd accepted him, they would have been freed from foreign domination. But the Jewish priesthood that dominated Jewish politics at that time, I've described the Jewish priesthood in the previous video of this series, link in description below. This Jewish priesthood, it felt its interests were threatened by the prophets that God was sending them just before the destruction of the Second Temple. So the Jewish priesthood, it fought against the prophet Zechariah, it fought against the Holy Virgin Mary, it fought against John the Baptist, and it fought against the Messiah, Jesus. When Jesus' life was in danger, God lifted him up to heaven. He wasn't killed, he wasn't crucified. Otherwise, he couldn't have been the Jewish Messiah, because according to Jewish tradition, the Jewish Messiah is someone who cannot be defeated. And if he was crucified, then he would have been defeated. And Jews, to this day, they use this argument to discount the claim of the Christians that Jesus was the Messiah, and the problem comes from the fact that the Christians believe that he was crucified. But according to the Quran, he was not crucified, and that's really significant. He was taken up to heaven so that he can come back at a later time as a righteous ruler. You could say a king, a righteous ruler of righteous people who obey God and follow and obey all of his prophets. The righteousness of these people will not be determined by their ethnicity, but it will be determined by their obedience to God. That's how Jesus himself describes righteousness in the Gospels, and that's how righteousness is described in the Quran. And these righteous followers of the Messiah, Jesus, will be from among the children of Israel, and they'll also be from among the righteous from all nations. They'll be Muslims. In other words, people who believe in all of the prophets and they believe in Jesus, but that's a story for another video. For now, what's important is that since the Jewish priesthood rejected the Messiah Jesus, and most of the Jewish people did too, God sent the Romans to destroy the temple for a second time and to banish the Jewish people from the city of Jerusalem once again. Okay, so if the Messiah already came, then why does it look like what Maimonides is saying about the Jewish Messiah is coming true right now? It has to do with religious corruption and something called Rabbinic Judaism. Let me explain. At the time of the Messiah Jesus, the most powerful Jewish establishment was the establishment of the Jewish priesthood. And the Jewish priesthood was dominated by a Jewish sect called the Sadducees. The Sadducees are recognized as morally corrupt by everyone, even mainstream religious Jews today, because mainstream religious Jews today, they come from a tradition that held the Sadducees to be morally corrupt. The Sadducees, they fulfilled the functions of the priesthood. They were appointed by puppet rulers, by the Roman state. They became very rich. They oppressed the people. They dominated the Sanhedrin, the religious Jewish court, and they were recognized by everybody as being morally corrupt. They rejected the afterlife. They said that there's no resurrection of the dead. That means that there's no accountability for what you do. They just used their position as Jewish priests to get the Jewish masses to obey them so that they could become rich and powerful. I talked about this corrupt Jewish priesthood in the previous episode, link in the description below, but there's another corrupt Jewish sect that I didn't talk about in the previous episode, and these are called the Pharisees. The Pharisees were not priests, they were rabbis. A rabbi is a teacher, a scholar, and they would answer the religious questions of the Jewish masses. And they had a tradition. That meant that they said that there's this great Jewish scholar, they called him a sage, who answered a religious question in this particular way in the past, and we adhere to this tradition. And so people would come and they would ask them their questions, and they became very influential. And they used to say that this tradition of legal answers that they belonged to was an oral law that had been taught by Moses himself. That Moses, when he went up to Mount Sinai, he didn't just receive the written tablets and the written Torah, but he received an oral Torah that was never written down, but it was passed down by word of mouth from teacher to student down to their times. And so they and their tradition of sages preserved this oral law of Moses, and that meant that if you went against their tradition, you were going against Moses, you were going against God. Now, the Jewish masses were upset with the Sadducees, and they thought that the Pharisees were less corrupt because they're less powerful. They don't have this religious establishment in the Jewish temple. So they would go to them for their answers. And the Pharisees, they said that you have to come to us for your answers, because if you don't come to us and you go to the Sadducees or you go to anybody else, then you're actually disobeying God, because we are the ones who preserved the oral law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. They didn't have any evidence for this. They were just saying this based on authority. And the reason why they were saying this is because it gave them power over the Jewish masses. They listened to them because they thought that this was coming from God. So it was like a priesthood, but it wasn't as powerful because they didn't control the temple and they weren't sponsored by the government. So the Sadducees, they had the upper hand. But the Pharisees were corrupt. They weren't sincere. They were just saying this because they wanted power and control over the lives of people. They wanted people to come to them. And we know this because when Jesus came and he brought evidence that he was a genuine messenger from God, he performed miracles. He brought the dead back to life. He healed the sick. There's many verses in the Quran that describe this. And he said that God here is confirming that I am a genuine messenger from him. This is an argument for the genuineness of messengerhood called the Quranic argument from miracles. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made this argument as well. It's not well known, unfortunately, but every Muslim needs to know it. I teach this argument as part of 3 other arguments in a course called Why Islam is True. You can check it out in the description below. So Jesus, he brought evidence that he was a messenger from God, and he corrected the Pharisees. He corrected the Pharisees by saying that some of the things that they were ascribing to Moses were actually corruptions. Moses never said them, he never taught them, and there was a corruption that had crept into their tradition where the rabbis, they enacted laws in order to preserve their control over people. And he also said that there were other aspects that were taught by Moses, but God was now abrogating them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that Jesus, he said to the Jewish people that he came مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيَّ مِنَ التَّوْرَةِ. He came confirming the Jewish law. وَلِأُحِلَّ لَكُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي حُرِّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ, and to make permissible for you some things that were made unlawful for you. And he said, وَجِئْتُكُمْ بِآيَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ, and I've come to you with a clear proof from your Lord. I'm performing all of these miracles. God is confirming that I'm a genuine messenger. فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُونَ, so fear God and obey me. He spoke on the authority of God. If the Pharisees were sincere, they would have followed Jesus. They would have told everybody to follow Jesus. But they went against this clear evidence. But they weren't sincere. They were using their religious positions for personal gain. And these religious positions were threatened by what Jesus was teaching the masses. The masses would now follow Jesus. They wouldn't follow them. So despite the existence of clear evidence, they rejected Jesus. And they accused him of apostasy. And they said, without evidence, that if people wanted to follow Moses and the oral law, they had to follow them, the Pharisees. So when the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they both rejected Jesus, and many of the Jewish people, they followed them, God sent the Romans, and the temple was destroyed. When the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees, their power was destroyed because their power came from the fact that they were priests in the temple, that they were judges as part of the Sanhedrin, and both of these things, they ceased to exist because the Jewish people now lost all political control. But it didn't destroy the power of the Pharisees because their power was not dependent upon the Jewish priesthood in the temple. Their power came from public acceptance of their religious authority. So they began to become more powerful, more influential than the Sadducees. And then something else happened, and this cemented their power. After the destruction of the Second Temple, there were many popular Jewish revolts against the Romans. Why was that happening? Well, just imagine for a second. Imagine for a second that a foreign power comes and invades Mecca and destroys the Kaaba. May that never happen. But imagine for a second that this happened. What would the Muslims do? They would fight against this power, expel it from Mecca, take over Mecca again, and make the Kaaba again. And that's exactly what the Jewish people at that time they wanted to do. The Romans had come, they had taken over Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like Mecca. They wanted to expel the Romans from Jerusalem. They wanted to rebuild the temple. The temple is like the Kaaba. I have a video about this, link in the description below. So naturally, they're going to want to fight the Romans, kick them out of Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple. And that's what was happening. One of these revolts was really successful. It's called the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba was a Jewish scholar who claimed to be the Messiah. He was a false Messiah, The Sadducees agree with this, the Pharisees agree with this, the Muslims agree with this, the Christians agree with this, secular historians agree with this. Everybody agrees he was a false Messiah. But at that point in time, many Jews, they believed that he is the Messiah, and at his hands, God is going to restore the great kingdom of the King David, and this is a sign of the end of time, and the Jewish people are going to become wealthy and powerful again, and they're going to be free of foreign domination, and they were willing to fight and die for the sake of Bar Kokhba. And as a result, this revolt, it caused many casualties for the Romans. Eventually, the Romans, they defeated Bar Kokhba, he was a false Messiah, but they suffered many casualties, and they didn't want this to happen again. The problem was, they knew that it was just a matter of time before another Jewish leader would come and say, I'm the Messiah. And then there would be all of these other Jews who would be willing to die for him, and the Romans would again suffer great casualties. This had to stop. So they looked around, they saw that the Pharisees were really influential amongst the Jewish masses, so they cut a deal with them. The Pharisees would use their authority to stop the Jews from rebelling, and in exchange, the Romans would give them power, some kind of power, over the Jewish people. So what did the Pharisees do? They changed the Torah, and they introduced a new law. This law is known as the three oaths. According to this law, it's called the three oaths or the three vows. According to this law, God made 2 oaths with the Jewish people and 1 oath with the other powers that governed over the Jewish people. The 2 oaths that he made with the Jewish people are, number 1, that they would never forcefully reclaim their holy land. They would never fight to reclaim Jerusalem from foreign domination. And number 2, that they would never rebel against the authorities that ruled over them. So they would never rebel against the Romans. And the 3rd oath, the way that this law goes, is made by the people who were governing the Jews, the Romans in this case. And they made an oath to God, kind of strange, because they don't even believe in the God of the Jews. But the way that it goes is that they made an oath to God that if the Jews kept these 2 oaths, then they wouldn't excessively persecute them. A little bit of persecution is okay, but not too much. What humiliation. What treachery. First, the Pharisees, they used their authority to tell the masses that they should disbelieve and fight against the true Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary. And then they used their authority to tell the Jewish people that they should just abandon Jerusalem, they should abandon the holiest city on earth, they should abandon rebuilding the temple. I'm sure that many Jews at that time recognized that the Pharisees were telling a big fat lie, because nobody in Jewish history had ever said that before. Abandon the city of Jerusalem? Abandon the holy temple, the holiest place on earth? But the Romans would only tolerate the Jews if they followed the Pharisees. And so the Judaism of the Pharisees, it became mainstream Judaism, and this is called Rabbinic Judaism. And the 3 oaths became part of this mainstream orthodox Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism introduces another scripture in addition to the Hebrew Bible. This scripture is called the Talmud. The Talmud represents the legal positions of the sages that were passed down, according to the Pharisees, orally from generation to generation, from Moses down to their times. So in Rabbinic Judaism, there's a scripture called the Bible, and there's another scripture called the Talmud, which is the legal corpus from which they take their legal rulings. And the 3 oaths are part of this legal corpus. And through these 3 oaths, the rabbis, they made it forbidden for religious Jews to ever actively do anything to force the appearance of the Messiah. They called it forcing God's hand. They said that the Jews have to patiently wait for the Messiah and that God will miraculously manifest him, but they're not allowed to do anything to expedite his coming. Now, this raises the question for religious Jews, how do we know that the Messiah has come? And that is the question that Maimonides was answering when he said that the sign that the Messiah will come is that he will successfully fight the battles of the Lord, and he'll gather the children of Israel back to the Holy Land, and he'll rebuild the temple. And elsewhere, he also mentioned that he'll sacrifice the 10th heifer, and sacrifices will be resumed in the temple, and the Jewish priesthood will return. Now that you understand what Maimonides was saying, you can see that it doesn't describe what is happening in Israel right now. Because it's not the Messiah who's gathered the Jewish people into Israel. It's the Jewish people themselves. And according to Rabbinic Judaism, that's an act of disobedience. And it's not the Messiah who's fighting the battles of the Lord. It's the Jewish people themselves. And according to Rabbinic Judaism, that's an act of disobedience. And it's not the Messiah who's sacrificing the 10th red heifer. It's the Jewish people themselves. And according to Rabbinic Judaism, that's an act of disobedience. And that's why Orthodox Jews were overwhelmingly against the creation of the State of Israel. But now that's changed. The story of the creation of Israel begins in Spain. Muslims ruled over Spain for 700 years, and there were many Jews who lived in Spain, and they thrived under Muslim rule, until the Christians took over in 1492, and then they told the Jews that they had to convert, die, or leave. And so they went two ways. Some of these Jews, they went to the Muslim lands in what would later become the Ottoman Empire. They thrived in the Ottoman Empire just as they had thrived before under the Muslims in Spain. These Jews are called the Sephardic Jews. And the creation of Israel doesn't come from the Sephardic Jews. The creation of the State of Israel, it comes from the Jews who left Spain and went and settled in Christian lands. These Jews who went to Christian Europe are called the Ashkenazis. Unlike the Sephardic Jews, they were never able to integrate into Christian culture because the Christians believed that the Jews had killed God. Christians believed that Jesus is God, and they believed that the Jews killed Jesus. Muslims believe neither. They don't believe Jesus is God, and they don't even believe that he was killed. But the Jews in Christian lands, because of this anti-Semitism, they were persecuted. They were denied property rights. They were routinely massacred. Calamities and crimes that had nothing to do with them were blamed on them. They were massacred, they were kicked out of their homes, they were expelled. They took everything that they could, went and settled somewhere else just so that the same thing could happen again. Their lives were miserable. These are the Ashkenazis, and the story of the creation of Israel comes from this group of Jews. What happened was that Christian Europe changed. Church and state were separated, and Europe became a group of secular nation states where belonging was no longer based on religion, but it was based on national belonging. Theoretically, the Jewish masses could now secularize, just as the Christians had secularized, and become full citizens of these secular nation states. But the traces of Christian anti-Semitism remained. And even though these states were secular, they were anti-Semitic, and the Jewish masses could not integrate into these secular nation states. And this is where the idea of a Jewish homeland emerged. Among secular Jews, they said that, well, the French have a nation state, the Germans have a nation state, the Jews, they should have a nation state too. By the way, references for everything that I'm saying from now to the end of the video can be found in the description below. The Ashkenazi Jews, they thought that if none of the modern secular nation states in Europe would accept them, then they needed a secular nation state of their own. And this is where the idea of the State of Israel was born. It was born amongst the Ashkenazi Jews in Christian Europe who were suffering tremendous persecution. But these Ashkenazis were non-religious, secular Jews. They rejected the authority of the rabbis. Jewishness for them was not a religious identity, it was a purely ethnic identity, like being French or being German. And they envisioned a secular nation state for the people who had the ethnicity of Jewishness. They did not accept the authority of the rabbis. They didn't want the rabbis to be in charge because the rabbis were opposed to the creation of Israel. Because as far as the rabbis are concerned, what the secular Zionists were doing was a violation of the three oaths. It was an act of disobedience to go back and settle in the Holy Land. And the secular nationalist Jews, they also thought that the rabbis were backward, too many rules, too many restrictions, can't live in the modern world. They were modernizing Jews. They wanted to make their own secular Jewish state. They did not want to be under the authority of the rabbis. The founder of Zionism is Theodor Herzl. He founded the Jewish Congress in 1897, and he's celebrated in Israel as the visionary of the state, because the Zionist Congress was the first in a series of events that culminated in the creation of the state of Israel. But Theodor Herzl was not religious. Many people say he was an atheist. He was envisioning a non-religious, secular state for people who were ethnically Jewish. And that was the vision of the early Zionist leaders. And it had to be, because according to the religious rabbis, what they were doing was an act of disobedience. It went against the three oaths. That's why in the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903, the British government tabled a proposal that was discussed by the people in the Zionist Congress about making a Jewish homeland in East Africa. There were some members in the Zionist Congress who were religious, and they overwhelmingly voted for the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people in Uganda instead of Palestine. Because if there was a Jewish homeland that was made in East Africa, then that would not violate the three oaths. But if it was made in the Holy Land, then it would violate the three oaths. The Jewish rabbis actually had a deeper reason for opposing the early Zionist movement. And that was that if the Zionist movement was successful, then the Jewish rabbis would lose their authority and control over the Jewish people. As long as the Jews were a marginalized community in Christian Europe or post-Christian Europe, then the rabbis would maintain control, they would maintain leadership of the Jewish communities. But if there was a secular Jewish state, then the existence of that secular Jewish state was based on the disempowerment of the rabbis, just as the existence of secular states in Christian Europe was based on the disempowerment of the Christian church. The Jewish rabbis understood that if a secular nation state arose, it meant they would lose power. And so they used the three oaths to convince the Jewish masses not to support this secular Zionist project. The secular Zionists won, the religious rabbis lost, and the secular state of Israel was born, and its first prime minister, David ben-gurion, was an atheist. But a group of religious rabbis, they saw an opportunity to take back control. They saw that if the narrative of the state of Israel could be changed from a secular nationalist narrative to a messianic narrative, a narrative of the Jewish people coming back to their holy land, heralding the appearance of a Messiah, destroying the Dome of the Rock, replacing it with a Jewish temple, bringing the Jewish priesthood back, reinstating the religious establishment, and then one of them claims to be the Messiah, then the secular project of Zionism will have been hijacked, and the religious rabbis will have gained more control, more power over the Jewish people than they've had for the last 2,000 years. And that's exactly what's happened. In modern Israel, secular Zionism has been replaced by a religious Zionism. And many people, particularly Muslims, aren't recognizing this. They're saying that Zionism is a secular project, and the problem is secular Zionism, and that religious Judaism is against everything that the Zionists are saying. But this is wrong. It's out of date. It might have been true partially in the 40s and 50s and 60s, maybe even in the 70s, but it's not true anymore. Traditional Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism has been replaced with a religious Zionism that wants to turn Israel into a religious theocracy that is ruled by the rabbis who incite the Jewish masses to war so that they can destroy the Dome of the Rock and bring on the Jewish Messiah who will rule the world from Jerusalem. On November 2nd, 1917, the British government wrote a famous letter to the Jewish banker Lionel Rothschild, promising the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. This is known as the Balfour Declaration because it was issued by Arthur Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time. It's one of the most important milestones of the Zionist project towards creating the State of Israel. But remember that this Zionist project was a secular nationalist project. It was not a religious project. And remember that the traditional Orthodox rabbis opposed it. At this time, because of this traditional religious opposition by the rabbis, there was someone by the name of Rabbi Abraham Kook. He is the founder of religious Zionism. He's known popularly as Rav Kook. Rav Kook wrote a letter. During this time, Rav Kook objected. He said that the Balfour Declaration meant that the three oaths were now cancelled. He likened Great Britain and the Allied powers to Cyrus the Great, who was a great Persian king who had returned the Jews from exile in Babylon back to their Jewish homeland and had helped them rebuild the temple. And he said that this meant that we are now entering into the Messianic age and the three oaths had been cancelled. Rav Kook's views are now mainstream views of religious Jews in Israel. I'm going to tell you how that change happened, but before I do that, I want to point out two things that other people aren't pointing out. The first is that if the Allied powers are like Cyrus the Great, and they're bringing the Jews back to their homeland, then it's very easy to see how the people who are in the Jewish homeland, the Palestinians, are like the Babylonians, the evil Babylonians who destroyed the Jewish people, destroyed their temple, and sent them into slavery. But of course, the Palestinians aren't like that. They didn't destroy the temple. The Romans destroyed the temple. The Muslims, Palestinians amongst them, venerated the temple by building the Dome of the Rock on its site. I've made a video about this, link in description below. And the Palestinians didn't send the Jewish people into slavery. It's Christian Europe that treated the Ashkenazi Jews like slaves and subjected them to persecutions and pogroms. This is a straightforward implication of Rav Kook's analogy, and it's because of this analogy that Netanyahu today can liken the Palestinians to the Amalekites.
זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים. לוחמינו וחיילינו אמיצים.
According to the Bible, God commanded the great prophets of the children of Israel to wipe out the Amalekites, to kill their women and children. I've shown in an episode how this is a distortion of the views of the great prophets of the children of Israel. They never said that. It's a religious corruption. Link in the description below. But that's what's believed by the religious mainstream, and the far right is using this as religious justification for the killing of innocent Palestinian women and children. The second thing that I want to point out is that the religious Zionists who use Rav Kook's analogy, on one hand, they're using the agreement of the great powers to justify the cancellation of the three oaths and the resettlement of Jews all over the world into the state of Israel. And on the other hand, when all of the powers in the world agree in the United Nations and they pass resolutions saying that the religious Jewish settlements on Palestinian lands are illegal, those same religious Zionists, they use religious justification to ignore this agreement of the powers of the world. This is the nature of religious corruption. It's not about moral consistency. It's not about truth. It's about twisting religious texts and using religion to control and influence the masses for personal gain. And that's why secularism is right in separating church and state, because of the reality of religious corruption. And that's why religious people should also be wary of religious corruption in every religion, and they should shun dogmatism, and they should use their minds and follow the evidence to do what's right and true. And when they do that, they will see that Islam is true. And that's what I show in the Why Islam is True course, link in description below. Let's return to the story. Because of Rav Kook's religious support for the Zionist cause, when, after the First World War, the British government formally took control of Palestine under what's known as the British Mandate, they appointed Rav Kook as the first chief rabbi of Palestine. And he began his career of collaborating with the non-Jewish powers and collaborating with non-religious, secular, atheist Jews. Traditional rabbinical authorities would see this as something terribly wrong, because he was collaborating with people who broke the Sabbath, they disbelieved in God, they violated His commandments, they broke the 3 oaths. As far as the traditional rabbinical establishment is concerned, these non-religious secular Jews are engaging in activity that will bring the wrath of God upon the children of Israel. And that's actually what many Orthodox rabbis said after the Holocaust. They said that the deaths of 6 million Jews were the fault of the secular Zionist leaders, because they had violated the 3 oaths and brought the terrible wrath of God upon the Jewish people. They were using religious language, but really what they were trying to say to the Jewish masses is, stop listening to these secular nationalist leaders, listen to us. Stop engaging in the Zionist project that will cause us to lose our power and control over you, and listen to us. But there was another group of religious rabbis who wanted power and control for themselves. They wanted to take it away from the traditional rabbis. And so they used the events of the Holocaust to make the opposite argument. They said that the persecution of the Holocaust was historically unprecedented in the history of the Jewish people. And because of this persecution, the 3 oaths had been cancelled. Because what was the 3rd oath? The 3rd oath was that if the Jews kept their oaths, then the powers that governed them would not persecute them excessively. But the Holocaust was clearly excessive persecution. And so the non-Jewish powers had broken their oath, and so the 3 oaths were now cancelled, and so we should move on with the Zionist project. This is why the Holocaust is so important to religious Zionists like Rav Kook and others, because it's part of their argument for the cancellation of the 3 oaths and justification for the creation of the State of Israel. If you look at this argument carefully, you can see that it contradicts Rav Kook's original argument. Because Rav Kook, originally, he said that the great powers were the good guys. They were like Cyrus the Great, returning the Jewish people to their homeland and helping them rebuild their temple. But now, the religious Zionists are saying they're the bad guys. The worst bad guys, worse than the Romans and the Christians who persecuted them. This is inconsistent. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say that the non-Jewish powers are good guys and bad guys at the same time. But the arguments of the religious Zionists are actually not clearly thought out rational arguments. They're rhetorical arguments. They're emotional arguments that move the Jewish masses away from the traditional rabbinical orthodoxy towards them, so that these religious Zionist rabbis, they are the ones who gain power, they are the ones who gain influence. And the more successful they are in doing this, the more power the secular Zionists give them. Because now there is religious justification for the secular Zionist project, instead of there being religious opposition to it, as the traditional rabbis have historically demonstrated. It's also important to note here that the arguments of the religious Zionists are grounded in the Ashkenazi experience of Jews in Christian Europe. It was Christian Europe that had persecuted them for centuries. and it was Christian Europe that committed the Holocaust. The arguments of the religious Zionists that are going to follow now, they're all grounded in this general idea that the nations of the world have always persecuted the Jews. But that wasn't the case in the Muslim lands. The Sephardic Jews, they thrived in the Muslim lands. Maimonides was a Sephardic Jew who thrived in the Muslim lands. With that, let's continue the story. Again, you can find references for everything that I'm going to say in the description below. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the secular Zionists continued collaborating with the religious Zionists because they saw that the language of religious Zionism, it was part of the DNA of the Jewish people. The language of the Messiah was a language that they had heard throughout generations. It was part of their daily prayers. It was something that gave them hope. It was the language that the Jewish people used in order to describe their path of freedom from persecution. And that's why in 1949, as the people of Israel were about to participate in the first elections to elect the first Israeli parliament, the Knesset, 200 leading religious rabbis issued the following statement. It's a long statement, but it begins like this. It says, "Let us give thanks unto the Lord for having, in His abundant mercy and kindness, granted us to see the first shoots of the beginning of the redemption through the establishment of the State of Israel." This language of redemption is religious language, and it's saying that the State of Israel is a stepping stone to the appearance of the Jewish Messiah, and that the Jewish people are obligated to participate and strengthen the State of Israel to further and expedite the appearance of the Jewish Messiah. This was the exact opposite of what the traditional Jewish rabbis had been teaching for the past 2,000 years. But when the secular Zionists, they promoted the use of this language, they accepted the use of this language, it even became mainstream, they had a different understanding of it. David ben-gurion, the first prime minister of Israel in 1949, he was an atheist, remember, he said that the Messiah has not come, and I do not long for the Messiah to come. The moment the Messiah comes, he will cease to be the Messiah. For Ben-Gurion continues, he was an atheist, and what he says is that belief in the Messiah is something that's useful for the Jewish people because it gives them hope. And so he was using, as an atheist, he was using the messianic narrative for practical purposes. But he said that if the Messiah ever did appear, it would turn Israel into a religious theocracy, and nobody in their right mind would want that. He was saying that the religious Zionists were useful to the secular agenda, but he never imagined that there would come a day when they would take over. Secular Zionists gave influential positions to religious Zionists so that it would help them in their cause. For example, traditional rabbinical authorities said that it was forbidden for Jews to serve in the army of Israel. That was a problem for secular Zionists, so they appointed an Ashkenazi rabbi to help them. The first Ashkenazi rabbi of the State of Israel recast all of the wars that Israel would fight as defensive wars. This involved complex legal arguments that nobody had ever made before, and it involved a religious recognition of the State of Israel on the grounds that if Israel did not exist, then the whole world would come and exterminate all of the Jews. This argument involved the idea that anyone who went to war against the State of Israel or said that it shouldn't exist was threatening the existence of the Jewish people. Because from the perspective of an Ashkenazi Jew, the history of the Jewish people was all about persecution by the Christians who they lived under. And the State of Israel was an Ashkenazi project. So according to the Ashkenazi rabbi, it was an obligation to serve in the Israeli army in order to defend the Jewish people. The Holocaust had only recently happened, and it was used as religious grounds to create the State of Israel by religious Zionists, as I just explained. And it's also now part of this argument to obligate the Jewish people, religiously obligate them to serve in the Israeli army as self-defense. And that's why the Israeli army is called the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. This name, it signals to religious Jews that joining the army is about defense, so it doesn't violate the 3 oaths. This is why in religious Jewish circles, the statement, Israel has the right to defend itself, has a deeply religious meaning, because the word defense is used by religious Zionists to reinterpret traditional prohibitions against going to war and making armies and returning to the Holy Land. People who don't understand the modern current of religious Judaism, they think that the statement Israel has a right to defend itself is just a rhetorical trick that's used by politicians and media to influence public opinion. But it's much more than that. It strikes a chord in the Jewish religious psyche, because religious rabbis in Israel have justified the very existence of the state of Israel, the very existence of the Israeli army, according to a religious narrative that says that everyone in the world is anti-Semitic, and the only hope for the survival of the Jewish people is the state of Israel. And anyone who says that the state of Israel shouldn't exist is someone who wants to bring back the Holocaust, to put an end to every Jew on the face of the earth. This is a non-rational, emotionally charged, and religious argument. And it's something that we need to understand if we want to make sense of what's happening in the world today. Over time, this religious argument has led to very strange interpretations of reality. It's been extended to Palestinians who want the illegal Jewish settlements to be dismantled. It's even been extended to Palestinians who want their homes back. This is presented as a danger to the state of Israel, and from there, a danger to the existence of the Jewish people. And so a war that is fought against them becomes a religiously justified defensive war. For the secular Zionists, their collaboration with religious Zionists has been very useful. First, it was useful in order to stop religious opposition to their project, but now it's actually helped them gather momentum for their project. Religious Zionist rabbis, they use Jewish law to justify Jewish settlements on Palestinian land. They use Jewish law to encourage people to join the IDF, the army. They use Jewish law to teach the soldiers in the army that they're fighting a holy religious war. And all of these things are useful to the secular Zionists because it gives them access to a large number of people who are willing to die for God and die for the state of Israel. But now the religious messianic narrative has gone crazy. Religious rabbis are using Jewish law to say that it's okay for soldiers to commit war crimes against the Palestinians. And they're citing the words of Rav Kook, the founder of religious Zionism, who said that when great war appears in the world, it's a sign that the Messiah is about to appear. And he said that as the wars and destruction gets worse and worse, it means that the Messiah is closer and closer. The general idea is that the Jewish people will not gain redemption. They will not gain great power until they put in great sacrifices. And so the events that lead up to the appearance of the Messiah are going to involve a lot of war, a lot of bloodshed. And so the more war there is, the more bloodshed there is, it's a sign that the right thing is happening and you should just have more of it. This has happened throughout history. It happened as recently as '93 in America. David Koresh, American cult leader, used similar language, similar techniques to drive dozens of his followers to commit suicide and kill women and children. But it's happening now in Israel on an unprecedented scale. The religious Zionists, they're moving people to sacrifice a red heifer, to destroy the Dome of the Rock, to build a Jewish temple, to bring back the Jewish priesthood. That's really important, to bring back the Jewish priesthood. This is the return of theocracy. And when one of these people claims to be a Messiah, Israel will turn into the worst religious theocracy that the world has ever seen, and it will be armed with nuclear weapons that are called Jericho. That's a reference to the Battle of Jericho, which was the first battle that the children of Israel fought in the land of Canaan, the Holy Land, in which they exterminated completely the population of the city of Jericho, including women, children, animals, except one person. I've made a video about this. You can find a link to that video in the description. This religious madness has to stop. It's not in anyone's interest for this religious madness to continue. It's not in the interests of the secular Jewish citizens of Israel for this religious madness to continue. Right now, everybody's caught up in a mob-like frenzy, but they need to calm down. They need to think carefully. Do they really want to turn Israel into a religious theocracy that's ruled by rabbis, where rabbis pass laws to limit their personal freedoms, where rabbis remove the accountability of the government to an independent judiciary, where they use the judiciary and the instruments of a theocratic state to suppress dissent, where they can use the judiciary and the instruments of the state to get rich and powerful through religious corruption? The existing religious establishment is already corrupt. Corruption watchdog Transparency International found in a 2013 survey that 73% of Israelis consider their religious bodies to be corrupt or extremely corrupt. You can find a link to the news article in the description below. If these religious bodies gain power and turn Israel into a theocracy, it's going to be a nightmare. The secular Jewish citizens of Israel need to ask themselves, do they really want the Dome of the Rock to be destroyed and replaced by a Jewish temple so that a Jewish priesthood can emerge and make the religious establishment more powerful than it has ever been in 2,000 years? Do they really want one of these rabbis to claim that he's a Messiah and use the religious masses for his own selfish interests to cement his own power? The madness of religious Zionism isn't good for Israel, and it's not good for the world. The spokespeople of the American government are telling the world that the conflict is about the preservation of freedom and democracy in the Middle East. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is not about the preservation of freedom and democracy. It's the exact opposite. It's about the establishment of a religious theocracy that the world has never seen. I think at the heart of all of this is that we need to be critical about religious claims to power. Secular people are already critical. They recognize that religious people who claim power are normally imposters, who are using religion for their selfish interests. I'm sorry to say this, but religious people are often not as critical, they're gullible, and they need to be more critical. Religious people, they just want God to love them. They want to obey God. And so somebody shows up, dressed up in a religious outfit, and says that here's how you obey God. And they want to obey God, and they just look at the outward form of a religious outfit, the fact that they're quoting some scripture, and they follow them. Religious people need to be open to the possibility that the religious authorities who are telling them what to do aren't doing it sincerely. They're just doing it for their own selfish interests because they want to control you. And if religious people are not critical in this way, then they will be taken advantage of. This is true in every religion. It's true in Christianity, it's true in Islam, it's true in Judaism, it's true in Hinduism. Every religion and every religious person needs to be open to this possibility and critically evaluate the claims of their religious authorities. When a religious authority tells you to use your mind and come to your own conclusions and do what you believe to be right, then that's a sign of sincerity. But when a religious authority tells you, don't use your mind and just follow me as an authority because God is telling you to follow me, then that's a sign of religious corruption. When a religious authority is humble, open to criticism, and comes down to the level of the common person, then that's a sign of their sincerity. But when a religious authority imposes their authority upon you and refuses to admit their mistakes, then that's a sign of their religious corruption. It's a sign of their arrogance and their insincerity. When a religious authority stands up for the rights of a common person against irreligious and corrupt governments, then that's a sign of their sincerity. But when a religious authority rubber stamps the corruption of corrupt governments, then that's a sign of religious corruption. So the question is that when religious rabbis changed the course of traditional rabbinic Judaism to support the creation of a Jewish nation state, then were they sincere or were they proud and self-righteous and corrupt and seeking power? Whenever a religious authority changes a religion, like the rabbis have done here, and whenever that change is clearly in their personal interests, as it is in the case of these rabbis, they gain power and influence through it, then the reason why they made that change was out of religious corruption, in order to seek power. People shouldn't change religion because religion is from God. The only reason why they would change religion is because they want to use it to serve their selfish interests, and that's religious corruption. If you've watched my videos on what's happening in Palestine, then maybe you've noticed that my approach is different from what everybody else is saying. Everybody else is saying that the problem is secular Zionism, that Zionism is a secular project and secularism is bad and secularism is the problem, and that religious Judaism is opposed to the secular Zionist project. But that's a mistake. That's not what's happening, and that's not what Muslims should be saying. Muslims should see the good in secularism. They should see that it aspires to be rational and moral. And they should see that whenever false religion is combined with any kind of power, then it becomes immoral and irrational, and it makes people's lives miserable. But they also need to say that there is such a thing as true religion, and that true religion is rational, and it is moral, and it's based on rational arguments. But this kind of a position, it can only be articulated if we understand these rational arguments for the truth of Islam, and that's what I teach in my Why Islam is True course, which is the most important course that I teach. Nobody is turned away for lack of funds. Please check it out in the description below. I want to explain this more by talking about the recent assassination attempt on Donald Trump and how that's associated with another crazy religious movement that's trying to plunge the world into war. In the next episode, I'll show you how the details of this assassination attempt are being orchestrated to make this happen and what it means for the region and for the world at large.